He was the richest man in the whole Roman world. And there was almost nothing his money could not buy. But two younger rivals had won the one prize his gold could not give him: the glory of a great conqueror. So in his 60s he led 7 legions east, across the Euphrates, to seize an empire and finally earn that fame. On a flat and burning plain, a far smaller army surrounded him and buried his legions under a rain of arrows. Tens of thousands of Romans died or were dragged away in chains, and the sacred eagles were lost in the sand. This is the story of the losing side. To understand how Rome's greatest fortune marched to its death, you must begin with the man who owned it. His name was Marcus Crassus, and he had made himself the wealthiest man in the Roman Republic. He bought burning houses for almost nothing as they blazed, then rebuilt them and rented them back at a profit. He owned silver mines, vast estates, and thousands of slaves, and could raise an army from his own purse. He had crushed the great slave revolt of Spartacus and lined a road with 6,000 crucified rebels. With Pompey and Caesar, he formed the secret pact of 3 men that quietly ruled all of Rome. Yet among those 3, he was always the moneylender, never the hero, and that wound never healed. For all his gold, he hungered for the one prize that had always slipped past him: the fame of a warrior. Pompey had conquered the East, and Caesar was carving new glory out of Gaul with every passing year. Crassus, now old and grey, could not bear to be remembered only as the richest of the 3. He looked east to the vast and wealthy empire of Parthia and dreamed of a conquest to rival Alexander. Parthia had given Rome no cause for war, and this was a campaign of pure ambition and greed. Even so, he took the province of Syria and gathered a great army to invade a land he barely understood. Warnings followed him from the start. But a man certain of easy glory does not stop to listen. In the spring, he crossed the Euphrates with 7 legions, some 40,000 men, and marched into Mesopotamia. The king of Armenia begged him to come north through the hills, where water was plenty and cavalry could not swarm. There, he promised, the high country would shield the legions from the deadly horsemen of the open plains. But Crassus refused, drawn instead toward the open road that led straight to the Parthian heartland. An Arab chieftain offered to guide him, swearing the enemy was fleeing, and the desert was the swiftest path. The chieftain was a traitor, secretly in Parthian pay, leading the Romans away from the river and its water. Deeper and deeper, the legions marched into a waterless waste of sand, with no shade and no end in sight. The men grew parched and uneasy as the guide urged them ever onward, and then quietly slipped away. At last, near a town called Carrhae, scouts came galloping back with word that the enemy was upon them. Out of the shimmering heat came the Parthian army, far smaller than the Roman host, but perfectly at home. Their general was Surena, a young nobleman who had brought archers on horseback and camels, loaded with arrows. First came a deep and unearthly thunder as the Parthians beat upon great hollow drums hung with bronze. Then they threw off their cloaks, and the desert blazed with the steel of armored knights and their horses. Crassus drew his legions into a vast hollow square, shields locked on every side against the coming storm. But the Parthians did not charge. They circled the square and poured their arrows into the packed ranks. The heavy shafts punched through shield and armor pinning hands to spears and feet to the burning ground. The Romans waited for the enemy to run out of arrows, as every foe before them always had. But the arrows never stopped, for the train of camels kept the archers supplied without end. Hour after hour the legions stood and bled, unable to close with a foe that would not stand and fight. Trapped in the open with no water and no escape, the greatest army on earth began to die where it stood. If the fall of the mighty moves you, take 1 second to subscribe, and stand with the losing side. To break the ring, Crassus sent his own son Publius out with the cavalry and the boldest of the legions. Publius charged hard, and the Parthians fell back before him, drawing the young Roman ever further away. Then the trap closed. The horsemen wheeled about and surrounded him, far from any hope of help. Cut off and overwhelmed, Publius and his men were shot down to the last, and he took his own life. The Parthians cut off his head, raised it high on a spear, and rode along the lines to show his father. Crassus saw the head of his son lifted against the sky, and knew in that moment that the day was lost. Yet he steadied himself before the men, and told them the grief was his alone to bear. The arrows fell all through the long afternoon, until the sun sank and the Parthians drew off for the night. The Romans were left broken in the dark, thousands dead, thousands more wounded, and crying out for water. Under cover of night, the survivors abandoned their wounded and stumbled back toward the walls of Carrhae. 4,000 men. 2 hurt to walk were left behind and cut down where they lay when morning came. There was no safety inside those walls, only a doomed and starving army trapped far from home. So the retreat went on, a ragged column melting away in the heat, hunted every mile by the horsemen. Whole groups lost their way in the dark and were surrounded and killed when the light returned. At last Surena offered a truce and called Crassus down to talk of peace and let his men go home. The soldiers, desperate and half dead, begged their commander to go and put an end to their suffering. Crassus did not trust the offer, but his own men all but forced him down to the meeting. He went out to the Parthians on foot, an old man walking to parley with the enemy who had destroyed him. Something went wrong in an instant. A scuffle broke out. Swords were drawn, and the talk turned to blood. In the struggle, Marcus Crassus, the richest man in Rome, was cut down in the dust of a foreign desert. The Parthians struck off his head and his hand and sent them east as trophies of their great victory. Legend says they poured molten gold into his mouth, mocking the thirst for wealth that had led him there. Of the great army that had crossed the river, barely a quarter ever found their way back to Syria. 20,000 Romans lay dead in the sand, and 10,000 more were marched away into slavery. Worst of all, the sacred eagles of the legions had fallen into enemy hands, a disgrace beyond words. For a Roman, there was no deeper shame than to lose the eagles, and Crassus had lost them in the desert. His name, once a byword for riches, became a byword for reckless greed and utter catastrophe. Parthia had shattered the invincible legions with horsemen and arrows, and paid a very small price. The Euphrates would remain the eastern edge of Rome's world for generations to come. No conqueror's fame would ever be carved beside the name of Marcus Crassus. He had marched east to stand as an equal with Pompey and Caesar, and instead he marched to his ruin. The death of Crassus did far more than end one man. It broke the balance that held Rome together. He had stood between Pompey and Caesar, the one weight that kept 2 giants from each other's throats. With him gone, there was nothing left to stop the 2 of them from turning upon one another. Within a few years, Caesar would cross the Rubicon, and Rome would tear itself apart in civil war. The republic that Crassus had helped to rule would not long outlive the disaster he began. In reaching for glory, he had pulled down far more than himself. Crassus had been the richest man in the world, and all his gold bought him nothing in the end. He had everything a man could own, and threw it away chasing the one thing he could not buy. He led 40,000 men into a desert they had no reason to enter, for the sake of his pride alone. They trusted him because he was Crassus. The great man who had never failed at anything he touched. And in the sand of Carrhae, tens of thousands of them paid for his ambition with their lives. He died far from Rome and far from his fortune, an old man broken by the fame he could not win. The mines and the mansions and the countless slaves could not save him from a rain of arrows. His body was never returned, and his eagles were never seen in Roman hands again. The wealthiest life in the Republic ended as a severed head carried as a jest across a hostile court. That was the price of one man's hunger to be remembered as something more than merely rich. Marcus Crassus had reached for the glory of a conqueror, and found only the grave of the losing side. This has been the story of the losing side.